Dimmi quando posso andare.
Vai pure, Roberto.
Buon pomeriggio a tutti, good afternoon. This is the fifth session of our conference. Is a European economy in the spirit of the VENTOTENE manifesto still possible? Once again, on behalf of the Fondazione Luigi Einaudi and the Jean Monnet Chair at the University of Torino, I am delighted to welcome you to this conference and this session in particular. This last session of the conference will focus, as the previous session, on the topic of the rules of European economy. The speaker will debate the issue of the rewriting the rules of European economy. Mario Cedrini, Professor of History of Economics at the University of Torino, will chair the session. I give the floor to Mario. Mario.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you for the presentation. And yes, we will have this session on rewriting the rules of European economy. We have 4 speakers, or 4 presentations, better. Okay, so each speaker has 20 minutes, and then there will be a general discussion of half an hour. Jan Kregel is the first speaker, and Jan Kregel, well, he's a leading post-Keynesian economist. He studied at Cambridge with John Robinson and Nicholas Calder. He's director of research at the Levy Economics Institute, Bard College in New York, and director of the master's program in economic theory and policy, and head of the Institute's monetary policy and financial structure program. He also is a teacher at Tallinn University of Technology. He's been rapporteur of the president of the UN General Assembly's Commission on Reform of the International Financial System in 2009. And of course, he has published many articles. I want also to remember that he is he's a member of the editorial board of the Annals of the Fondazione Luigi Einaudi. So his presentation is about growth and the single currency, the fiscal policy paradox. I think he can now share his slides, and I leave him the floor.
Ok, grazie Mario. Adesso facciamo questo che funziona, perfetto. No, la presentazione io non avevo deciso se facevo questo in italiano o in inglese. Forse è meglio di farlo in inglese perché questo è tutto scritto qua. Okay, to give some background, what I'm presenting here is part of a document that we produced when I was advising Paolo Savona when he was a Minister of Foreign Affairs under the first Conte government.
Io mi è cominciato un webinar che devo fare, però...
Ok.
Bene. Nel weekend sentiamo.
We're okay?
Yes, everyone else than you should shut the microphone down, but then, yeah, please continue.
Yeah, okay. And as I said, what we were at that time attempting to do was to find some way to reignite the discussion of national fiscal policies. So if you look at I can get this thing to work now. Okay, there we go. If you look at the argument that we used, it was one that fit pretty closely with the work of Spinelli, and I want to start out by posing the question. If you look at the manifesto and you say, well, what is the thing which is not there? Well, European unity is there, yes, but in fact, there's nothing there on money and finance, which is rather interesting, because if you think of the way the eventual Maastricht Treaty and following evolved, it was forcibly centered on the creation of the single currency, which in fact predated the discussions of the Maastricht Treaty. So this is the first point that I want to raise, and I want to pick up this idea of just exactly what we mean, or what we can mean by European unity. Now, as I pointed out, there's nothing there on the European unity of money and finance. But if you look at the original project that Spinelli had proposed, and which eventually ended up as the groundwork for the European Union Treaty of 1984, you find two articles. The first, Article 73, a system of financial equalization shall be introduced in order to alleviate excessive economic imbalances between the regions, okay? And that there should be a system that would be laid down for applying this particular system. So when I found this particular item, I said, well, this is just exactly what we're looking for. That is, it was originally there in the proposal, but strangely it got left out of the treaty. The second was Article 71.2. The Union may, by an organic law, amend the nature of the basis of assessment of existing sources of revenue to create new sources, and a law to authorize the Commission to issue loans without prejudice. So in fact, we also have in this original document the proposal for direct financing by the Union and the issue of its own liabilities. Now, as I point out, neither of these survived in the final treaty revision. And this is the point that we wanted to pick up, and to say that if there is some idea of European Union that we can salvage from this original period, this is it. Now, as I mentioned, what we ended up with was a single currency. And the idea was that the single currency would eventually provide some sort of cohesion or some sort of unity. And the argument that we made was, in fact, that if you look at the introduction of the single currency, in fact, it introduced what I'm going to call here asymmetry. And I'm going to use asymmetry precisely because that term was also used in Keynes' discussion of the clearing union. So that if we think of the idea of the single currency, the implication of the fixed European exchange rates, this occurred first of all in an international system with floating rates. So what it did was to eliminate the possibility of exchange rate adjustments amongst the members of the community, but it allowed everybody else in the world to use exchange rates, in fact, to adjust their external positions, to use it as a policy position. So this is the first idea of asymmetry. Secondly, the fact of the exchange rate variations of the Union relative to the rest of the world was also then uniform across member states. But at the time of the introduction of the single currency, there were still wide divergences across countries. So there was a variable impact due to the differences in domestic production structures and the structure of external trade of the members. So this is a second idea of asymmetry that was introduced as a result of the single currency. Finally, the necessity of introducing a uniform monetary policy, that is, if you have a single currency, obviously you have to have a minimum uniformity in terms of monetary policy. You ended up with an additional point of asymmetry, because the interest rate policies, again, would have a different impact across the member states, and it would bring about changes in, I'm talking here about investor preferences for dollar-denominated holdings, changes in capital flows, and the direct impacts of these capital flows on the performance of individual countries. And in particular, this is an element that we saw in the 2007-2008 run-up to the 2007-2008 crisis, in particular in Europe, where if you take the comparison between capital flows to the northern and the southern states, you note that almost all of the capital flows into the southern tier were in fact into what we would call non-productive or non-efficient types of investments, particularly investments in real estate and things of that sort. There's some very good work which was done both by the central banks of Greece and Spain, pointing out that most of the capital inflows that came into the southern region did not go in improving productive efficiency, but simply went into increasing asset prices. So that we end up then with the idea that you ended up with a single currency issued by an institution without any direct linkage to a national government or to a national government's balance sheet. So basically what you had done is that you tied your hands from any sort of policies that would have countered these asymmetries, because the only way that you could have responded to these asymmetries would have been in terms of fiscal policy. Now, at the same time, the idea of the elimination of fiscal policies meant that, as we all know, this is the famous question of austerity. This meant that what you were doing was shifting all policies in terms of domestic wage and price adjustments. And this is a further idea of asymmetry. Asymmetry, why? Well, as we discovered when you did the calculations of what adjustments in Italian wages and prices would have been necessary, it wasn't simply a question of looking at the absolute changes, but they had to be relative changes. So if Germany was deciding to reduce their wages and prices by 15%, in Italy, in order to bring about this internal adjustment, you would have had to decrease wages and prices by a multiple of the amount in Germany, which again would have produced this asymmetry in terms of the policies that were required in order to place adjustment. So the last item is then the question of debt asymmetry, and this is the point which we tried to emphasize greatly, is that going into the single currency, as long as you had very large differences in accumulated debt stocks, all of these asymmetries would have a reinforced impact on the inability to adjust. Why? Because as a result of these changes in interest rates, changes in wages and prices, and so forth, this would have a direct impact on the ability to run down debt stocks, so that any policies which would have been required in order to bring about a reduction in these outstanding debt stocks, again, would have required a multiple of the policies which were being undertaken in policy in the rest of the union. So obviously all of these asymmetries end up with what? Well, the simple idea, and here I bring some very nice quotes from Wynne Godley, who pointed out the very general problem. And that general problem was that if you didn't have some mechanism for domestic fiscal policy, which in fact the single currency had given away, you had no possibility of looking at adjustment. But the point that we were trying to make is that it was a much more detailed, or I might say a much more subtle point, and that was it was not only the fact of not being able to use fiscal policy, but the fact that the single currency created all of these additional asymmetries. And these additional asymmetries made it that much more necessary to have a differentiated domestic fiscal policy in order to offset those asymmetries. And this is going back to this section 772 that was originally in the Spinelli project. So that if we look at Godley's position, if we look at the secondary argument, the interesting point is that the Germans were also of more or less the same position. That is, if you look at the the writings of the board of the Bundesbank at the time of the Maastricht Treaty, you find a very similar type of argument. The one I put up here is one by Ottmar Issing, and I have to sort of admit this is the time when I was still teaching in Bologna, and I was teaching at that time also at Hopkins, as well as in Scienze Politiche. All of these Germans loved to come to Bologna. So they would very nicely come and do seminars at for the students at the Johns Hopkins Bologna Center. All of them, to a man, were against the introduction of the single currency. And the passage that I put up here is the one from Otmar Issing, who at that time was not a member of the board. He was in the research department. Historical experience shows that national territories and monetary territories normally coincide. The relative legislation, as a rule, defines monetary sovereignty in relation to a national territory. In contrast to the normal rule, the Maastricht Treaty implies a clear discrepancy between the intentionally rather modest political integration and monetary integration. Basically, the position of the Germans was, first we go to European Union, exactly the same argument that you find in the work of Spinelli and in the Manifesto, that you want the political union first and then you allow the monetary union to come. Those of you who are old enough to remember this this discussion, this was this so-called debate between the economists on the one side and the structuralists on the other side. The structuralists, which basically who were at that time supported by the Italian government, was that going to the single currency would eventually bring about interrelationships. Again, a personal argument here at this time. Hyman Minsky was an advisor for the W.R. Grace Company. Jim Bertle was the chief economist, and they were looking at the Italian position of the Communist Party to the introduction of the single currency. So High sent me to Jim Bertle as an advisor, and Jim Bertle asked me, he said, will the Communist Party ever support the single currency and this path to reunification? Now, guess what my response was? Absolutely no. They will never do this. And in fact, what we discovered was, in fact, there was this very strong political push that, in fact, this was something which should be created. So again, this was the idea that the structuralists were going to have the upper hand, and it was the structuralist position which was going to become dominant. Now, the rest of the presentation, which in fact I'm not going to have time to present, so I'm just going to go over. If we look at the application of these asymmetries, and this was the thrust of the argument that we're making, is that basically the 2008-2009 financial crisis was basically caused by these particular asymmetries. That's obviously the beginning of the crisis was in the US financial system, but its passage to Europe and its passage to the Euro and the European economies was in fact due to all of these particular asymmetries that were the result of the implication of, as we said, the uniform monetary policy, the uniform exchange rate, and the uniformity of the kinds of adjustment measures that were required. So as I said, the rest of the presentation goes on to make this this argument that if you look at the kinds of fiscal policies which are required in order to adjust to these asymmetries, what you end up with is a policy which, by definition, creates increased financial fragility. Why? Well, very quickly, we'll go to my favorite diagram. This is the diagram which was produced by one of our scholars at the Levy Institute, Rob Parenteau, which puts together the famous godly financial balances and looks at the balances between the private sector, the external sector, and the government sector. And very simply, the argument behind this is that if you're looking at the necessity of having a particular type of fiscal policy which is constrained by the requirements of the single currency, it places constraints on private sector and external sector imbalances. So the natural result is that if you are going to offset the fiscal surplus, how are you going to offset the fiscal surplus which is required in order to support the uniform currency? Well, as I said, you have a choice between increasing the external surplus, or you have the choice of increasing the domestic deficit of the private sector. And in fact, what the argument is that what the austerity policies require is that if you're going to have this fiscal surplus, and if you have a difficulty in bringing about an increase in your external surplus, by definition, this means that you're going to be increasing the indebtedness of the domestic private sector. So that in these particular conditions, and again, the argument is the one for asymmetry, if you have one country, if I can find now the, here is the appropriate argument. If you have one country or one group of countries, in particular, that group of countries turns out to be Germany within the European Union, if you have Germany and the Netherlands are the countries that are always in external surplus, it means that within the Union, the rest of the Union is going to be an external deficit, and the rest of the Union vis-a-vis the rest of the world, and remember this is our second asymmetry, is also going to be in deficit. So that by definition, if you then impose on these countries a fiscal surplus in order to support the currency, by definition, it means that you're going to reduce the stability of the private sector. That is, you can only do this by increasing the indebtedness of the private sector. And this then brings about creating financial instability. So the final point of the proposal which we made was that then in order to preserve financial stability within the single currency is supported as much by private sector stability as it is by fiscal stability, then by definition this means creating some sort of mechanism by which individual countries have the ability to run differentiated fiscal policies. And as I've already mentioned, when we started out, the point of this was Article 73, a system of financial equalization to alleviate excessive economic imbalances between the regions. So in fact, this is something that was there from the beginning. Well, we won't say from the beginning, but from the discussion of the 1980s and the single currency, that was a necessary part of what Spinelli believed was appropriate for the European Union. Okay, so that's more or less the end of the story, and I hope I've stuck to my 20 minutes. But again, the point that I want to bring up is that we have this mythology of the single currency creating this structural uniformity, and in fact, if you look very closely, all the single currency does is to create all of these asymmetries in the performance across countries without providing any particular mechanism to offset them. And the only mechanism that we have available is some sort of differentiation in fiscal policy. Mario, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian, also for respecting time constraints. Actually, we are 19 minutes exactly, so thanks so much. I think we should proceed by listening to all presentations and then have a general discussion with all these things in mind. And so the next speaker of today is Annamaria Simonazzi, and she has a paper. She has a paper entitled "Falling Behind: The Long-Term Consequences of European Policies." Now, if I manage to find my presentations, and of course, and this is the beauty of.
Meanwhile, I'm trying to
I'm sorry.
cap the.
Okay. Of course, I cannot find it in any case. Annamaria Simonazi comes from University of Roma La Sapienza. She is also a primary role in Fondazione Brodolini. She is one of the co-editor of Economia e Lavoro, the journal, and she has recently published a very important book with Dario Guarascio, Andrea Ginsburg, and Giuseppe Celi, exactly about a sort of a core periphery vision of the European Union and imbalances that affect the European architecture. So I will immediately leave her the floor, and thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Mario. And let me thank Roberto Marchionatti and the Einaudi Foundation for the opportunity to present this paper, which is actually a follow-up of the work that we have done over the years on the European Union problems. I'm trying to find my presentation, which I can't find it. Oh, let me see. Oh my God.
Hai permesso come host di sharing, di condividere lo schermo?
Sì, sì, ma non vedo la presentazione che avevo preparato. I'm sorry, I don't. Let me see. Lascio e riprendo perché non vedo proprio dove sta. Continuo a non vederla. I can't see my presentation.
Did you send it to me, because I have your paper, but not the presentation?
No, I didn't send it to you because I didn't. I don't know what. It usually works, but it doesn't this time. Well, maybe we can. I don't want you to waste time. And perché non funziona? Disattiva video, disattiva.
So you want us to pass to the third presentation? And
Yeah,
then...
maybe it's better, but I don't know if it is going to work afterwards. Condividi schermo. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Ah, good.
All right. Okay.
Sorry for this. I'm trying to go on the beginning. Yes. Okay. So, as I said, this is a follow-up of the work that we have carried out over the years, and it has some connection with the idea of asymmetries that Ian Kregel just presented. This is the index, the outline. I will have a look at the structural roots of the divergence, going through the European lost decade, and the COVID-19 as a game changer, and then to the what can we expect in terms of structural change in the pandemic. So I will start with the diversity of the members of the European Union. The constitutive purpose of the Union was promoting communion between peoples and convergence and harmonization between economies. Instead, the integration process has resulted in a European Union that has become more diverse, unequal, and divisive, with a growing divergence between core and periphery, increasing inequalities within countries, and a mounting acrimony among peoples. So the European Union survival is threatened by external and internal disrupting forces. The abrupt shift from rules to power from globalization to protectionism, and from Europe to Asia, have shaken Europe's conception of order. Widespread disaffection within the European Union with the European project challenge the Union from within. Brexit undermines confidence in a European response to changes in the global political order, though paradoxically making a unitary political response to the crisis easier. And finally, the asymmetric effects of the pandemic-induced crisis on the European countries is exacerbating divergences. Its southern member countries were already in a highly precarious and unequal condition. They never completely recovered the losses in output, employment, and fiscal sustainability produced by the 2008 crisis, and are less able to offset the cost of COVID-19. So the paper looks at what can be done, what is to be done. At least for the time being, the centrifugal forces threatening disintegration of the EMU seem to have been diffused, albeit only in part and in extremis. However, and this is the argument of the paper, the survival of the Union depends not only on responding to the severe financial problems caused by the epidemic, but also on addressing the long-term structural problems that led to the increasing divergences among its members. Convergence is essential to put the Union on a more solid basis so as to guarantee its long-term sustainability in a stormy international environment. The dilemma of the European Union is simply this. Its members are condemned to stay together, but at least until now, each one is for himself. So what policies and what reforms should be implemented to pursue long-term sustainability? And are the current answers up to the challenge? And most important, are they economically and politically feasible? We argue that understanding the structural causes of the growing divergence within the European Union is fundamental in order to find the right answers to the economic, institutional, and cohesion crisis that the European Union is going through. So I will start with the problems of the institutional structure of the European Union. The principles that guided the unification process were based on two critical assumptions. The first is the monoeconomics claim, as Hirschman defined it. Disregarding the peculiar problems of latecomer countries, the European Union's institutions were shaped on the premise that all its members were on a level playing field, except for certain less modern institutions, individual values, and attitudes. The implicit assumption was that an austerity regime associated with institutions close to those assumed to be prevailing in the core countries would create the right environment for growth in the periphery. The second assumption was the mutual benefit claim, i.e. the assertion that economic relations between core and peripheral countries could be shaped in such a way as to yield gains for both, thus denying the different consequences deriving to their economic and institutional structures from the interdependent relations between the two groups of countries. So the idea was that one size could fit all, and the results were that the structural causes of divergence can be explained in terms of the divergent trajectories of interdependent economies with different productive capabilities. And this process was inserted in a macroeconomic transition from a politicized management of economic policy based on discretion to a depoliticized management based on the automatism of rules. We have spoken about this morning. With the attribution of objective and thus higher knowledge to technocratic expertise. In the process of European integration, the southern peripheral countries were thus exposed to macroeconomic and industrial policy measures that, although apparently neutral, generated different effects and increasing regional disparities, both between core and periphery and within countries. So free trade between unequal partners within a deflationary macroeconomic environment fed divergence in a so-called cumulative causation. And I'm going through three main steps in the process of Europeanization that increase the divergence between core and periphery. The first one was the 1970s upheaval, the change in consumption and production patterns and in competition from price to quality occurring in the 70s, and the restructuring, the increasing competition from developing countries, the disinflation, financialization, and foregone devaluation in a context of neoliberal market framework. And this led to premature deindustrialization. And here again, I give just two examples of a common policy with very different implications for countries that are on a different level of development with different institutions. The German disinflation have implied different costs for core and peripheries because of labor market institutions' differences and because of different price elasticities, input contents. So the costs of disinflation were much higher for the Southern European countries than for Germany. The second example is industrial policy, which came to be redefined as competition policy. But these liberalization policies had different effects depending on the level of development. Because for latecomer countries, industrial policy is mainly made by state aid, public enterprises, soft loans and subsidies to private firms, which are already targeted to the competition arm of the European Commission. While in core countries, the industrial policy is more made of a coordination of the system of production. We have a thick network of firms, research agencies, public institutions, local development banks. That is, industrial policy is, so to say, active under the radar. This then led to divergence. The institutional features of the euro area were not such as to sustain the capacity of the Southern European countries to achieve a sufficient level of diversification and specialization in their productive structures. Indeed, they may even have contributed to worsening it by aggravating the conditions of their poor regions, although increasing regional dualism did not spare the core. Let's think of Germany, for instance, but France. While powerful counterforces were slowing down the pace of the institution-building reforms required to complete the Union, the institutions and reforms already in place preempted any alternative policy. So, explaining one word of caution. Explaining the increasing core-periphery divergence with the institutional features of the European Union construction does not imply exempting the ruling classes of the southern periphery from their responsibilities. Indeed, there is quite a lot of criticism for the Italian political and entrepreneurial class, which has been voiced by many scholars. The second step and the second moment of increasing divergence is represented in the, let's say, late 90s, early 2000 by two further shocks. The first was China. The accession of China to the World Trade Organization meant different things once again for core and periphery. It was a huge market for Germany. It was a powerful competitor for southern periphery. The second shock was the eastward enlargement, a redirection of German foreign direct investment and trade to eastern countries. So this meant that Italian wages were set more and more in Beijing or in Bratislava rather than in Rome. The competition dumping from the East, Eastern Europe, fiscal subsidies, low wages and low labor conditions, poor labor conditions, put pressure on the South. This was domestic devaluation. But it also threatened and put pressure on the trade unions, German trade unions and German wages, plus complemented by the harsh reforms. So we had increasing inequality in Europe, but also in Germany. And this sort of diverted consumption from Southern Europe to cheaper imports from China. And again, we had the lower input costs for German firms, which reduced inflation and put even more pressure on domestic devaluation, as Jan Kregel has just mentioned, on the Southern European countries' wages. And so we end up with two peripheries, the southern one made up of the Mediterranean countries and the eastern one with the prominent role of the Visegrad countries that both suffer from different fragilities, which descend from their common, albeit diverse, economic and financial dependence on the core. However, the core itself is dependent for its growth on the pattern of specialization within the European Union, the southern markets providing an outlet for its increasing surplus of manufacturers, the eastern countries supplying cheap inputs for its industries. This combination of structural divergence and economic interdependence lies behind the fragility of the Union as well as of the improbability of its disintegration, given the high cost it could entail for core and peripheries alike. Then we have the European lost decade. After a brief Keynesian spell, austerity followed the 2008 financial crisis, and austerity killed domestic demand in the whole European Union area. In the South, demand, production, and income fell dramatically, feeding public and private debt. And on the other hand, the Eastern periphery is basically a global production platform. Trickle-down effects to the domestic economy are still very limited. So, with domestic demand subdued, both peripheries or some of their regions have become ever more dependent on Germany, on German exports, and this leads to the vulnerability of export-led policy. The German economy became, and the whole European Union area, became increasingly dependent on world demand. And the changing global order, with the US and China becoming more and more protectionist, challenged the export-led model of the whole Europe. Then came the COVID-19, and one could ask, is this a game changer? Well, compared to the post-2008 crisis, the response to the pandemic has been much faster. The European Central Bank's intervention has been swift, large, and targeted to more fragile countries. On the fiscal front, the Stability Pact was suspended and state aid regulations temporarily relaxed. National governments undertook huge increases in public debt to subsidize firms, workers, and households. Then came the Next Generation EU, which was ushered in by the Franco-German agreement and hailed as an Hamiltonian moment. The euro rallied, appreciating against the dollar, and even high debt countries enjoyed extremely low or even negative interest rates. The enthusiasm of the first hour, however, soon faded, raising questions about adequacy, timeliness, and effectiveness of the project. So, is this a Keynesian movement? Will the remarkable monetary and fiscal activism mean a rehabilitation of Keynesian theory? Well, to answer this question, we need to clear up the confusion between Keynes's analysis of the saving-investment relation and Keynesian policy, which is usually understood as the policy of generic public investments or undifferentiated incentives granted through credit or taxes. Well, let's see at what Keynes theory means. There has been, after the crisis, the pandemic, an almost unanimous consensus on the urgency of monetary plus fiscal policies. However, we still find the supremacy which is still attributed to savings as a permissive condition for investment. The reference to the need to return as soon as possible to rules of sound finance, the categorical exclusion of any form of debt cancellation, the influential minority in the European Central Bank's Governing Council that, dismissing the danger of low inflation in a heavily leveraged European Union, opposes coordination with fiscal policy and favors a lower target range that would allow to end monetary easing sooner. All this suggests that we are still simply within the textbook Keynesian case of depression. Then there is the meaning of what a Keynesian policy is. And here there is this paper by Carabelli and Cedrini, which I want to refer to. They are treating this point very clearly. But as Keynes reminds us that economics is a method of analysis rather than a recipe book, a science of thinking in terms of models joined to the art of choosing models which are relevant to the contemporary world. Policy belongs to the political realm, and conditions surrounding the applicability of theory to policy are often political in essence. So Keynesian policy does not imply that there are no constraints, and problems of false consciousness may impose caution. This concerns how to manage the public debt, to return to the Stability Pact, how to restart growth by combining demand and supply policies, and refers also to the importance of the composition and the quality of demand, and the importance of industrial policy, which is a fundamental instrument of policy. And now then I will see what happens after the pandemic. There is a similarity between the 70s and the 2020s. As in the 70s, the EU is confronting new epochal changes in the world of production, with digital transformation, new consumption patterns, reversal from globalization to regional blocks, as well as growing inequalities and disenchantment with the European project. COVID-19 has speeded up the adoption of new technologies and structural change. So Europe must compete in a global market with nations that are actively supporting their industries in the innovation race. These changes call for a common coordinated response that requires radical change in the institutional and productive structures of the Eurozone. But instead, European countries are moving individually, each for himself. So is the European periphery falling behind? Once again, as in the 70s, these changes risk to worsen even more the gap between core and periphery for three reasons. First, Industry 4.0 related opportunities are maximized when they interact with a closely connected technological advanced network, which is often missing in latecomer countries. Second, full exploitation of new technologies requires digitalization along the entire value chain. Without the accompanying experimentation and technical skills, simply importing technologies and machines may prove inadequate to the task of adapting to the new organization of production, which is based on systems integration that operates at both the technological and the organizational levels. The traditional industrial policy based on granting subsidies, tax breaks, or credit facilities is not up to the task any longer. Regional and national systems, once thriving on incremental innovation, can be put to the test. And the third reason relates to the change in competition. There is a commodification of manufacturing parts and components in the global value chain. They belong more and more to a flex price market. The company heading the value chains has complete control over cost, technologies, production conditions, and decides on the distribution of profits along the value chain, and even on where to locate the different segments of the value chain. On the other hand, digital companies, the big tech, compete for market shares in a monopolistic market where competition is not based on price, there might not even be a price, but on preempting the market by buying out potential competitors. The omnipresence of digital technologies in industry and services offers these companies enormous power of penetration, control, and profit over the rest of the economy. In this competition, national companies and their governments are in a symbiotic yet contradictory relations. Companies need their government's protection in domestic and foreign markets, but delocalization choices risk impoverishing large segments of their domestic value chains. So, last point, is there a German U-turn? Germany and the entire Europe are falling behind in the tech race. Not even Germany can go along in the international arena. And it has two options. It can go together with the other member countries that is taking care of the development of the whole European area, or it can go as the leader of an economic empire. But past experience demonstrated the short-sightedness of the latter option. But what kind of way the German decides is also determined by internecine conflicting interests, small versus big business, industry versus finance, political conflicts, which sway German choices in European and foreign policy in the midst of the geopolitical turmoil. For instance, Merkel's U-turn on the Eurobonds may respond to concerns on the breakdown of the Eurozone, which is contrary to the German economic and political interest, but the rapprochement with China may conflict with the European choice. So whatever German choice is making has different consequences for the German value chains that are in the two peripheries. So, and this is the last point, what is a true Keynesian policy? On my view, we need to prevent the digital transformation from becoming an additional factor of polarization. And this will call for massive investment in the weakest areas aimed at strengthening infrastructure facilities, industrial capabilities, and technological transfer. A new, more cohesive industrial policy could not succeed without a U-turn in macroeconomic philosophy. The EU should focus on the development of demand and supply strategies that place greater reliance on the domestic market at the EU and national level. Export-led policies clearly disrupt the long-term sustainability of the Union and are meeting with increasing hostility at the international level. And it also demands to defuse the debt bomb and avoid deleveraging. The new generation EU plan can represent such an opportunity. However, to be effective, it should work in the direction of reducing the inequalities between core and peripheral member states, with the economic crisis first, and then the pandemic aggravated. And it requires swift and efficient use by receiving countries, which must show themselves capable of seizing this last opportunity to bridge the gap with the rest of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your very interesting presentation. And well, as said, we will have a general discussion after the four papers. So I will not take too much time and move towards the third presentation by Daniele Archibugi. Can we build a Europe of science and technology? Of course, Daniele Archibugi graduated in economics at La Sapienza. He took his PhD at the University of Sussex. He is the research director at the Italian National Research Council in Rome. He's professor of innovation, governance, and public policy at London Birkbeck College. And he's served as advisor for United Nations, many national governments, the European Commission. Of course, he is currently chairing the European Commission's expert group on a wide opening of the European research area to the world. He is the author of many articles and books. Just to remember some of his latest publications, the Handbook of Global Science, Technology and Innovation, Wild in 2015, Innovation and Economic Crisis, Lessons and Prospects for the Economic Downturn, 2011, The Globalizing Learning Economy, 2001, but of course, the list is endless, almost endless. So I'm pleased to leave the floor to Daniele for his presentation. You can share the screen.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your words. Thank you very much to the Fondazione Einaudi for organizing this event. Let me say that the VENTOTENE manifesto is very much into my heart for a variety of reasons that I would like to mention. First of all, Eugenio Colorni did not meet my father, because my father was too young and he died too soon, but he was very close to some of the close friends of my father, including Leo Solari, which I met very well, and which was a biographer of Colorni, including Mario Zagari, including another young person which didn't meet Colorni but was very close to him, which was Giorgio Ruffolo. My father was a good friend of Ernesto Rossi, which after the war worked on economic reconstruction, and we still have a lot of Ernesto Rossi's books with some drawings in the front page. He used to give books with drawings. Last but not least, I myself was lucky enough to meet Altiero Spinelli. Even before I graduated, I met him when I was a stagiaire at the European Commission, and Spinelli was a member of the European Parliament. He left the Italian Parliament to join the European Parliament. And at the time, we had a few discussions about the opposition between federalism and functionalism, as usual. And at the time, Spinelli was very much working in order to achieve greater European integration in all the various levels. So I am quite close to the federalist ideas, which in Turin has quite a strong section, but I'm happy to say that the paper I'm going to present today is much more specific, and it is devoted to one policy which might help to reach the overall target, namely science and technology only. But what can be done in the domain of science and technology and innovation in order to get a closer Europe, more integrated Europe, and also more, if you like, let's use this word, a more powerful Europe in the world economy. And I got a few slides. Let me see if I manage to get them. Sure. And the first slide is very simple. And it shows what is the distribution of research and development. One indicator of can you see the slides?
Yes, you should simply put them full screen if you can.
In full screen, it's okay, I will.
Thank you.
And let me see, where is it? Good, it's okay. And as you can see, of course, Europe is challenged not only by the incumbent United States, not only by Japan, but also by new players such as China, India, Brazil, and so on. And therefore, it is quite important to wonder what will be the future of the European Union in science and technology, especially if you see that so far we have got quite a lot of different countries which have got often different policies and different strategies. As Anna Simonazzi has indicated for other economic indicators, of course, Europe, the European Union, is made of different countries, different regions, and there are enormous differences across the north, the center, and the south, and so on. And within the European Union, we have got some areas which are the very top in terms of investment in research and development, such as Sweden, such as Finland, such as Switzerland, even if not a member of the European Union, such as Germany, of course, which is a big component, and other parts which are very, very peripheral, and so far are managed to invest much less than other parts. How can we sort out this problem? For years and years, at least for the last 35 years, since I started to work in this field, you hear the same mantra: spend more, spend more, spend more, invest more, invest more, invest more. These are arrived at the very top of the European policy making. For example, the European Council said it in Lisbon: Europe should become the largest knowledge-based region of the world. The European Council in Barcelona, we are to reach 3% in terms of R&D GDP ratio, making the European Union at the same level than Japan, above the United States, and so on. Of course, when there are these flamboyant targets, it's very difficult to specify what should be done. 3%, what does it mean? It means that Romania and Portugal should reach 3% in terms of R&D over GDP, or should mean that the total average of the European Union should be 3%, which might imply that there are some regions, such as Germany, such as Finland, will reach 4, 5, 6%, as it happens in, as we would say, in some regions of the world, or does it mean that it should be consistent across the 28, now 27 members of the European Union? And that's, since it was a tricky question, was wisely left unanswered by both the European Council and any other political body. Of course, you can say targets are not there because they should be achieved. Targets are there because you hope that they will move into the right direction. But at the end, was there in Europe an increase in public expenditure devoted to research and development and knowledge? And the answer is no. Definitely didn't help the fact that there was a financial crisis, but as it was clearly indicated by the other presentations, the financial crisis had some more serious effects in terms of public expenditure, including R&D, on the weak parts of the European regions, and less on the others, you know? As is, on the other hand, helped to increase business investment devoted to technology and innovation, or to induce large multinational corporations to move to Europe, the answer is again no. So we are precisely in the situation which was left 20 years ago. After the financial crisis and now within the COVID crisis, we are in the same situation as before. So let's have a look at what we can see in terms of distribution. And the first thing that I mean, this is not surprising. That is a map of Europe in terms of research and development. But unfortunately, all regional indicators look similar. And therefore, if you look at other indicators, such as investment in, or education, we have got a highly diversified Europe. Is that bad? Well, yes, of course it's bad, but it's not necessarily too bad. And therefore, if we can make a comparison with the other federal system, the United States of America, where is it? Here we are. We see that also in the United States of America, there are major differences. I know, Ian, that today you might like to use the same data also for electoral purposes. And you will find out that the regions which have got a higher R&D intensity are the regions we voted for Biden, and the regions with a lower R&D intensity are the regions we voted for Trump. But that is outside the scope of this conversation. What I really would like to say is that the problem is not so much the distribution across regions, but that we need to take into account also another major factor, namely how the knowledge is distributed across countries. And in this level, Europe, the European Union, is paying a much higher price than the United States, because the devices which will allow to transmit knowledge across the different unions are much weaker than the same devices which do exist within the United States. And that because we speak different languages, because we have different history, because we have got nations which, in comparison, get larger powers and functions than within the United States. And therefore, this is something which should be discussed. And just to make an example, I mean, think about academic societies. This is perhaps the best way in which we might understand it, because most of us are members of academia. If we look at the American Economic Association or the American Political Science Association, you really see that they manage to act effectively as institutions which distribute knowledge across the United States. If up to the point that many of us would prefer to attend the American professional associations rather than the European associations, even if we are Europeans, because, for example, we will get a larger number of participants. I mean, the American Hematology Association, for example, has meetings we managed to reach 16,000 medical doctors in this field. Can you imagine? So anytime there is some new development, some knowledge development in one area, this has a device which allows to transmit the knowledge to everybody. In Europe, these devices are much weaker at all levels. In the academic level, also in the technical field. Let's think about European Robotics Forum compared to the automation technology expo in the United States, and so on. And therefore, one of the crucial issues that we need to identify is what can be done within the European Union in order to foster and to increase the devices for the production, of course, but also for the distribution of knowledge. First of all, we rely on national governments, and we ask national governments to spend more, to invest more in knowledge generation activities, because we are aware that there are quite a lot of externalities. And therefore, if some knowledge, some major developments are developed in any part of the European Union, at a certain point, there will be some benefits which are disseminated elsewhere, and not only in Europe. Often, we try, in the European Union, tries to use regulations. And again, for example, if we think about Ursula von der Leyen plan for the Green Deal, this also works on the old notion of induced innovations. You create some regulations, you give some time, and therefore you force the European industry to comply with the regulations and therefore to introduce innovations. Sometimes it's not working well. For example, in terms of hybrid cars, Europe, European manufacturing industries was late, and only now is managing to bridge the gap, while Japanese and Korean corporations manage to be much quicker, and something similar might apply also to the electric car. Harmonization is the other very powerful instrument. The Bologna process, of course, which all of us know very well. As you know, we had to compromise with the United Kingdom in order to get something which was specific also to the United Kingdom. The compromise was so good that when the United Kingdom managed to get what they wanted, they decided to leave the European Union. And that, of course, was very tricky of them, you know. But that's another way in which we managed to do that. Finally, direct intervention at the European level, not carried out with national money, but with national money which is distributed by the European Union. Typical example, the European framework programs to promote science, technology, education, and innovation, Erasmus, and so on. And they have been very good. They have been very good and very useful. But I would like to discuss something more about them. First of all, let's look at the total amount spent by Horizon 2020 each year. And let's compare this budget with the R&D budget of some major corporations. You see, first we have got Samsung, then Alphabet, then Volkswagen, then Microsoft, then OneWay. Sixth, we have got the Horizon 2020. And so we have got other major corporations at the same level. It's a lot of money which goes into Horizon 2020, but we have not to forget that at the end of the day, Horizon 2020 is about the same annual budget for R&D, for research and development, of some major corporations. So it's not enough. We know that this is strategic, that there are multiplying effects, that the Horizon 2020 does not pay the fixed costs, but pay the additional costs, and therefore there are a lot of additional factors which manage to increase their effectiveness. But still, we should take into account that is a budget which can be compared with what one single large corporation does. And if we look at the targets, as a pupil of Federico Caffè, I got this bad habit to think in terms of instrument targets and instruments, objectives and instruments. You really see that the framework programs often had to achieve two conflicting objectives. One of the objectives was cohesion in science and technology across nations and regions. What does it imply? It implies that at a certain point you have some networks. Perhaps this network is assigned on the ground of merit. It's more likely that it's going to be won by a British, Dutch, German, French institution, no? But in order to win the project, they have also to show that the project is leading to cohesion in science and technology. And therefore, they will do their best in order to involve the project some colleagues from Portugal, from Greece, from Poland, from Bulgaria, and so on. And it's good. It's good. I know by my experience, and that I think is an experience that many of us got around this forum, that by working together with colleagues with different experiences, there is also a process of dissemination and learning, you know. But on the other hand, there is another target, which is to achieve excellence within Europe when we have to compete with big American corporations, especially in emerging sectors, in critical sectors, in what, you know, the drivers of scientific and technological change. And often, if you do that, it's very likely that you will not find the excellence in peripheral areas, but at most within Europe in the central areas. So what do? Do you try to improve the performance of the peripheral areas, either Portugal or Bulgaria, or you try to concentrate within the French, German capabilities so that you can build something which is going to compete with the Silicon Valley? And this, I think, is the paper which has circulated is precisely discussing this point, namely the two conflicting objects of being on the one hand a device for excellence or a device for dissemination of knowledge. And of course, if you look at the money, the Horizon 2020 is paid by everybody. Luxembourg, Denmark, and Belgium are paying more than any other countries. And also, they are also those receiving more money than everybody else. And of course, now that the United Kingdom has left, we can also make a budget. And you will see that there are some countries that made a net profit. Imagine who is top number one. The United Kingdom. Second is the Netherlands. And that perhaps explains why my colleagues in British universities, Sue knows very well it, were of course very keen to be in the European Union, you know. And then we've got other countries which are making a loss. And these countries are Poland, Italy, Germany, and France. Germany and France. So the two countries which are contributing quite a lot to the total pool of resources for this framework programs of the European project are also those making a loss. So what next? Let me say that I regard the European Recovery Fund in the specific domain of science and technology as one step forward and two steps back. And I will explain why. The step forward is that eventually this has put a final cross to the austerity policy. So my colleague Sue Konzelmann will speak about that. She's an expert about austerity. And we can really see that the way in which the European Union is reacting to the exogenous COVID crisis is the opposite to the way in which it has reacted to the endogenous 2008 financial crisis. We can, of course, we have a lot of regrets. If the very same Angela Merkel would have taken an opposite perspective in 2008, perhaps Europe would be better off. and will be stronger also in terms to create a federal Europe on the lines of the VENTOTENE manifesto. But, and therefore, this is the step forward. The step back is that, surprisingly enough, it is left again to the national governments to decide how to invest these resources, including for science and technology. Is not, as you know, over the last month, there was a battle in order to decide if the next framework program Horizon Europe should have been downsized in order to finance the recovery plan. What's the difference? The difference is the Horizon Europe is managed and organized by the European Commission through European devices. The Recovery Fund is organized by national authorities. And with national authorities, which sometimes are very good in order to implement the projects, perhaps the case of France, and in other cases, such as the Italian case, we are really struggling because, to go back to what we were discussing at the beginning with Ian, because in some countries there are not what Keynes would have advocated, namely a list of projects ready to go and to be implemented as soon as there was a financial possibility to do that. And so every time we had to invent the projects. And when the time is short, to invent the project might require 1, 2, 3 years, to say nothing about closing a project, since I'm still waiting to see the underground stop at the Colosseum to be constructed. I'm going to finish and by arguing what's next in terms of policies for a European Union of Science and Technology. First of all, of course, there is very much the important factor of asking national government to invest more. Now that they've got the resources, as it was reminded earlier by Francesco Saraceno, we are speaking not only on physical infrastructures, we are also speaking about research, innovation, human resources, education, and so on, and this is part of the investment, fortunately. But anyhow, Horizon Europe will not provide enough resources to compete on a par with the United States and with emerging countries, and most notably with China, especially in the areas which are the crucial areas for technological level. The big tech are all Americans. I would like to know how many people are in the room, 10, 15. I would like to know if any of us has a European computer, if any of us a European mobile phone, you know? No answer.
A European mobile phone.
Who is that?
Ben Crum.
Oh, so happy to hear. So happy to hear, you know. Turin is very close to Ivrea. Ivrea was a place where there was an important corporation, Olivetti. What happened to Olivetti?
European computer.
Precisely, European computer. What happened? You know, so, but this is the story. What about artificial intelligence? What about how come that so many of the vaccines that we are so much waiting for will come and will shipped by American multinational corporations and so on? And I think this shows that something should be done. What is my suggestion? We don't need only money. We need also European public companies. Is that brave? Yes, it is brave. And there are 2 cases only in which the European government tried to do something in order to enter into an emerging market. Some of us will remember La Défi Américaine by Screnbrecher Brand, which was a popular book in 1967. He discussed at the time that the aerospace industry was going to be fundamental. Perhaps he was wrong, but he was right because he managed to persuade the French government that something should be done, and there were 2 ventures. One was Concorde, United Kingdom and France. The second one was Airbus, France again, and Germany. The first one was a failure for a variety of reasons. The second one was a success. After more than 50 years of struggles, Airbus is the leading corporation in the market. It takes time. It requires political support. You have to fight at the World Trade Organization. You have to fight in a lot of other places. But I think that if Europe would really like to become a Europe of science and technology, we as Europeans also need to create our own corporations in emerging areas such as those of the Green Deal, such as those of artificial intelligence, or such as those of social networks, you know? I mean, I got kids at home, and after Facebook, after Instagram, after whatever it's called, whatever it is, now they start to be on TikTok. Is it European? No, it's Chinese. So perhaps we Europeans can do something better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniele, for this very interesting presentation. And so now we have the last presentation by Sue Konzelmann and Marc Fovargue-Davies, Birkbeck, University of London and University of Cambridge. The title of the presentation is The United States of Europe, an idea whose time has come or gone. Sue Konzelmann, she's an editor as well of the. She's a member of the editorial board of the Annals of the Fondazione Luigi Einaudi. She's a reader in management at Birkbeck. She's also director of the London Center for Corporate Governance and Ethics, co-executive editor of the Cambridge Journal of Economics, and a research associate in the Cambridge University Center for Business Research. Her research work concerns the political economy of austerity, corporate governance, stakeholder relations and economic performance, organizational behavior, and a variety of capitalisms. And she's the author of Austerity, 2019, and the co-author in particular of a forthcoming book, The Return of the State, Restructuring Britain for the Common Good, with Patrick Allen and Ian Toporowski. As regards Marc Fovargue-Davies, following a degree in archaeology and cultural anthropology and a career in consulting, he's currently a research associate with the London Center for Corporate Governance and Ethics, Birkbeck. Formerly strategic marketing consultant and brand development specialist, he's also a freelance journalist, of course, specializing in socioeconomic issues, politics, and yachting. And he's the editor with Sue of Banking Systems in the Crisis, The Faces of the Liberal Capitalism, 2012, and co-author of Labor, Finance, and Inequality, with co-authors, among whom Sue Konzelmann. Okay, so I will give you the floor for this United States of Europe. Thanks for accepting our invitation.
Great, thanks. Let's see, share. Uh-oh, what went wrong?
I've not seen that screen before.
Something went wrong. Wait just a second. Oh dear. Wait, maybe I can do new share. There we go. I was trying to share the wrong screen. There we go. And then, okay, so are you seeing my slide? Yep, okay, great. This paper actually has a rather convoluted history. At first, when we've talked about this before, well, over a year ago now, I thought it would be on federalism. And so I did a lot of research, including doing a lot of research on Daniele's work on perpetual peace projects and going all the way back. Then I got to American federalism, learned more than I thought I needed to know. Anyway, the paper eventually got to be about 50,000 words, at which point I thought, well, we've got to narrow this down to something. So it ended up being quite a different paper than we originally thought it would be, but a much more interesting paper, I think. The starting point for our paper is the resonance between the economic and social conditions and policies of the interwar years and those of today. On the surface, we're witnessing very similar social responses and a distrust of the institutions of laissez-faire capitalism. During the 1920s and 30s, this produced nationalist tendencies which during the Second World War, Spinelli and Rossi were responding to with their VENTOTENE manifesto. Now, this image of Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy is a very familiar image. Much less well known is the fact that very similar things were happening in other places, notably in London and in New York City. Now, today, we call it populism, but it has some very sort of eerie reminiscences with the kinds of images that you see in these three from the 1920s and 30s. For example, this is very recent images of things that are going on in Germany, in France, in Spain, and in Greece. We've seen similar movements in London, and more recently, you probably remember some of these images from Capitol Hill. Now, what our paper does is reconsider the interwar experience with a view to trying to understand not only the forces that gave rise to extreme nationalist tendencies, especially in Italy and Germany, but also, as we saw in the images a few minutes ago, Britain and America. Now, these ultimately gave rise to dictators and another world war, which is what Spinelli and Rossi were responding to in their VENTOTENE manifesto. But perhaps more importantly, we're interested in what were the forces that helped to prevent extreme nationalism from taking hold in both Britain and America. Now, the question of why major shifts in social, political, and economic policies and paradigms occur, or indeed fail to materialize when it seems very likely that they should, is a topic of long debate. And when the 2008 financial crisis arrived, and then in the 10 years after that, it was a debate that reemerged. And we contributed a bit to that because we wrote a book called Labor, Finance, and Inequality that was asking the question in 2018 of what would it take after the financial crisis to see some sort of shift in the dominant paradigm of neoliberal economics. What we did in our book, where we looked at the example of Britain from the Industrial Revolution to the present, was we developed a model that we call the Insecurity Cycle to try to help explain the dynamics of what we saw going on, starting all the way back with the Industrial Revolution. And we use that same model in this paper, although we adapt it to try to explain what we saw not only in Britain, but also America and Germany and Italy between the wars. And the ultimate objective is to try to shed some light on the lessons that we might learn for today from the kinds of things that we've experienced, especially since the 2008 financial crisis. Now, the insecurity cycle is illustrated on this slide, and its dynamics are driven by the interaction of economic and political forces within society, as opposing interest groups, working classes on the one side and wealthier capitalists on the other, apply pressure on the state to try to shift the focus of policy towards their own interests and perspectives. Now, the way it works, if we start with market liberalization box, for example, is during periods of market liberalization, the insecurity caused by rising unemployment, poverty, and inequality is likely to put pressure on those affected to put pressure on the state for protection and social intervention. And if they're successful, at some point that will trigger a counter response, which is putting pressure on the state to liberalize markets. Now, if you assume a functional state, the existence of institutions capable of representing the interests of the various groups within society, and confidence in the state's ability to mediate between these differing interests, what you are likely to see is pendulum shifts between varying degrees of social interventionism and market liberalization. However, if you don't have a functional state, and especially if either or both sides lose confidence in the fact that their interests are being effectively represented, this mediating effect of the state is removed. And this paves the way for extremism on one side or the other, or both, or at least that was our hypothesis as we started to do the research for this paper. Now, if we consider the case of Britain, for example, we identified in our book 4 discernible shifts in policy that either took place within the dominant paradigm of the time or represented a paradigm shift. Now, the first two, from laissez-faire capitalism to the beginnings of the welfare state with the liberal social reforms that preceded the First World War, were followed by pushback during the 1920s and 30s by the Treasury view that austerity was required to repay wartime debts and balance the budget. Now, these shifts were all shifts within the dominant paradigm of the time, which was neoclassical economics. The first complete paradigm shift accompanied the so-called Keynesian consensus following the Second World War. But it's important to note that it took nearly 150 years to come about. This was, however, effectively reversed less than 30 years later, with the return to pre-Keynesian neoliberal ideas and policies during the 1970s and 80s. Now, the 2008 financial crisis, which, like the crises of the interwar years, severely shook confidence in free market capitalism, and now the COVID pandemic, could produce another shift. But as yet, it's uncertain whether that shift will take place within the current conventional wisdom of neoliberalism, or whether we'll see a departure from that in the development of an alternative paradigm. And some of the papers that have been presented at this conference, I think, give me hope or suggest that it's possible we are in fact seeing a paradigm shift in the developments that have especially been in response to the pandemic. In particular, the reversal of austerity, where austerity was ultimately the response when it appeared that the financial system had been saved after the 2008 crisis. Now, when we examine these shifts and look at the case of Britain, and this comes out of the academic literature on paradigm change, each time there was a shift in policy and a paradigm within the British example, there were 5 key things present at the time, some combination of them. The first was a crisis, usually of considerable duration, such as the Great Depression or the Great Recession, which is now continued on into the crisis of the pandemic. But such a chronic crisis is often exacerbated by shorter acute crises. Democratic or social pressures, which are usually the greatest at election times, can also be highly influential. Over the years, this has produced the emergence of trade unions, the expansion of the franchise, and more recently, socially based movements, or what's been called populism. We've also seen the presence of new, or at least alternative, policy ideas and credible political support for them. Radical uncertainty and/or overconfidence have also been present in some form or another when we've seen these shifts. Now, the factors behind the rise of the 2 dictators during the interwar years and subsequently the war that resulted in the VENTOTENE Manifesto were primarily economic, but they were certainly not unique. During the interwar years, Italy, Germany, Britain, and America all confronted a broadly similar set of economic circumstances, which in turn put pressure on social cohesion and confidence in the institutions of the state. Spinelli and Rossi, and Keynes before them, had objected to the asymmetry of globalized laissez-faire capitalism, which at the time, like today, was very closely aligned with rentier interests. Its tendency to generate inequality and poverty for most people had significant implications for peace. But they didn't advocate radical or revolutionary overthrow of capitalism and replacing it with something completely different. In their own ways, both Spinelli and Rossi and Keynes sought to manage what was going on, to manage the capitalism that they had inherited, and reform it in such a way as to deliver the societal benefits, the good life that both Spinelli and Rossi and Keynes before them believed so important. So what made the difference? If we consider the factors driving the insecurity cycle, and we look at the 4 cases which we lay out in our paper, interestingly, it was very difficult to piece together the American and the British cases, because communism and fascism during the interwar years have been pretty much effectively written out of history because of, obviously what happened between the wars. But they were very important in both Britain and America, and leaders at the time were extremely concerned, and Keynes in Britain, Roosevelt in America, extremely concerned about what might happen if you saw social breakdown moving in, either the extreme right direction of fascism or the extreme left direction of communism. Now, when we look at the factors driving the insecurity cycle in the cases of interwar Britain, Germany, America, and Italy, in all four countries, there was a chronic crisis. There was also a significant degree of working class and industrial unrest that gave rise to frequent periodic acute crises. Democratic pressures in all four countries and social pressures were very strong. All four countries had their own communists and fascists, and all four explored corporatist ideas to address the economic industrial challenges confronting them. But the failure to address the extreme economic difficulties of the general population in Italy and Germany produced fascist dictators who used corporatism to fund military expansion and aggrandizement of the state. By contrast, in Britain and America, the ultimate objective was ultimately to support the general population by addressing the economic pressures they confronted. And the ultimate aim in both Britain and America was to improve the social and economic security for the majority of citizens. Both countries also experimented with corporatism, although that too has been pretty much written out of history. But in their experiments with corporate planning, they sought to bring both sides of industry together to help provide the resources required in order to provide the economic and social security for the majority of the population. In all four countries, there were also different approaches to new ideas and alternative ideas. In Italy and Germany, once Mussolini and Hitler were in power, every media was used to promote the fascist agenda, with all other ideas and interest groups being suppressed. In Britain, the idea of formalizing left-wing pressures within the existing political system, rather than resisting them, provided institutional voice for these groups within the Labour Party. It was hardly without its problems, but it helped to isolate the more extreme communist factions in Great Britain at the time. The idea of maintaining the welfare net established by the liberal social reforms prior to the First World War was also very important in Britain. In America, new ideas included welfare reforms under Roosevelt's New Deal during the 1930s, and the New Deal also strengthened the position of organized labor for the first time. So that was also important because it gave voice to what became a very important interest group within American society, especially during and following the Second World War. There were also key differences in the credibility of political leadership and support within the four countries. Unlike Italy and Germany, neither Britain nor America produced particularly convincing fascist leaders. Although interestingly, while in Italy, fascism was organized under the ultimate leader of Mussolini, and in Germany under Hitler, America and Britain had very factionalized, especially within the fascist movement, a really factionalized group with lots of different leaders. I mean, interestingly, in America, Charles Lindbergh was closely allied with fascism, so was Henry Ford. Both of them were given awards by the German government for, the things that they were contributing to the German cause during that time, which is almost unknown. I was completely shocked when I found out about it. But what that did in both countries was hamper the fascist movement because it divided the group, and so they didn't really get anywhere. In Britain, British governments during the interwar years shifted within the existing political party system, with the Labour Party ultimately replacing the Liberals as the main opposition party in government. America also produced progressive political leadership with the 1932 election of the Democratic President FDR, who during his 4 terms in office was able to sell and implement the new ideas embodied in the New Deal, which did a lot to stabilize the social and economic situation in America. I mean, it's interesting, there's been speculation on what would have happened had Charles Lindbergh run for president against Roosevelt, because he was a hero at the time. And if he had won that election, we might have had a very different outcome. Now, the insecurity cycle was originally developed to help explain the drivers or inhibitors of significant social, economic, and political change in Britain. And we started with the Industrial Revolution and traced that all the way up to 2018, which is when our book came out. But in our research for this paper, we found that it's also able to explain pretty well the experience of the United States between the wars. Despite the existence of extremist political groups, particularly the fascists, and the outbreak of social tensions, in both countries, the institutions of the state proved successful in managing these tensions. The objective in both cases was crisis management, but the aim was to support the majority of citizens in maintaining, and it was also to maintain and strengthen the institutions that gave voice to both labor and industry in experiments with corporatist planning. And what this did in both countries was help to balance both fascist pressures on the far left, or the far right, and communist pressures on the far left. By contrast, in interwar Italy and Germany, you didn't have the sort of functional institutions and functional state institutions in particular that you had in Germany in America and Britain at the time. And so what you saw was dysfunctional institutions of the state, the political economy, and society combining with institutional breakdown to create the conditions that proved favorable for the emergence and strengthening of extremist groups and alternative political movements and parties. Under Mussolini and Hitler, the fascists were well enough organized, and they were able to give hope to people within society who had lost confidence in the existing system to represent and reconcile their interests. This ultimately brought them to power, but they didn't deliver on their electoral promises, at least not to the majority of citizens. So in both countries, the state proved unsuccessful in managing extremist groups and social tensions, and that allowed these groups to exploit the crisis. And once they were in power, the objective became the aggrandizement of the state. Following the Second World War, having learned lessons between the wars, both Italy and Germany received the support required to reintegrate their economies into the community of Europe. And across the industrialized world, the general move towards more Keynesian approaches produced a decisive shift to the left in the insecurity cycle. So you had around 30 years of support for citizens, support for social welfare. So sort of you see the one side of the insecurity cycle shifting towards social interventionism. However, it only took 30 years for things to shift equally decisively back to the return to laissez-faire during the 1970s and 80s. Now, the response to the 2008 financial crisis, which is the most serious since the 1929 Wall Street crash and Great Depression, brought harsh and prolonged austerity to much of Europe, particularly the UK, which voluntarily opted for austerity, and Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Ireland, which had it forced upon them as a condition for financial assistance from the Troika. Now, this is reminiscent of Brüning's strategy of austerity and Weimar Germany, when the American finance that had been flowing in to help pay the war loans from the First World War dried up. And so Brüning implemented very harsh austerity. And in response, Hitler campaigned on an anti-austerity platform, which ultimately brought him to power. In Britain, the Labour Party, as a result of austerity, swung sharply to the left, and tensions over continued membership in the European Union escalated. Across Europe, in response to austerity, so-called populist parties and movements grew stronger, and we saw images of some of those earlier in the presentation. Now, so far, the responses have not been as extreme as they were between the wars, probably because despite austerity, there's a greater degree of welfare protection to mitigate some of the effects than there were between the wars. Between the wars, these did exist in Britain as a result of the social reforms introduced by the Liberal Party prior to the First World War. And in America, they were made available during the 1930s under Roosevelt's New Deal. In both cases, this helped to avoid succumbing to the extremes of both fascism and communism. By contrast, in Italy, the extremely low level of social and economic support for the general population and their serious erosion as a consequence of austerity in Weimar Germany would have catastrophic results. Today, the legacy of more than a decade of austerity, despite the reversal when COVID arrived, is eroding these stabilizers. And if there isn't a rebuilding of the public and social infrastructure that has been gradually worn down to the point where it was unable to cope with the COVID crisis when it arrived, we may see further adverse social, economic, and political consequences ahead. So it's an important time for governments to recognize, that this is a risk, that if they don't, take the moment, could be a moment lost. So what of the manifesto, the VENTOTENE manifesto, and its relevance for today? A central feature of the manifesto is the overall outcome that was intended, a better and livable life for the majority of citizens. Keynes felt much the same way, and you see that permeating everything he wrote and all of the policies that he advocated. Spinelli and Rossi, on the one hand, and Keynes on the other, had that same objective, although they had differing ideas of what might be required to help deliver the good life for society and what could be expected to hinder it. But we think what's important is that objective of a better life, a livable life, a good life for the majority of people was the motivation for both Keynes and Spinelli and Rossi. We, however, have the benefit of a much longer view of history. And with that, the knowledge that the return to globalized, laissez-faire capitalism today has been accompanied by the conditions that caused so much misery between the wars. While the events that motivated Spinelli and Rossi's VENTOTENE manifesto and Keynes's the economic consequences of the peace were ultimately overcome. As evident in developments since the 2008 financial crisis, they have certainly not gone away, and we ignore them at our peril. Thank you. There we go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, okay, we had all 4 presentations of the afternoon. We can now have a general discussion about these the issues dealt with in this presentation. So I invite you to raise questions, also using the chat if you want. Yes, Mario Telò has a question, I think. You can also raise your hand like this, actually.
Yes. Thank you very much, everybody, for this splendid panel, very interdisciplinary and transatlantic. So thank you so much. I start by the last presentation by Sue, which is I totally share in the not only in the conclusion, that is the actuality of the very soul of the Spinelli message, which compared with Keynes is a regional message, European, not, whereas the Keynes message is more ambiguous about these issues, whether national or global, Bretton Woods, but not really focused on the European dimension. I share also your method. I worked very much on the comparison between the American New Deal and what I called the European New Deal. And I added to the comparison to UK, the Scandinavian countries, which are also providing ideas, leadership, institutions, making possible a democratic exit out of the crisis. I think and Belgium also was providing a democratic issue out of the economic crisis. I think this was the very test whether progressive forces, democratic forces, liberal forces were able to provide a way out of the economic and social crisis. This was the crucial point. Unfortunately, this was not possible to do at European level in Europe because the Europeans were very marginal in the 20s and 30s. But this is the reason why Spinelli is more actual than ever now, because we have now the instruments, the institutions, the social movement parties in favor of a European solution. We have the recovery plan. Recovery plan, which can be criticized, someone criticized, but is an historical step forwards. And is truly, someone said, a Keynesian moment, Simonazzi. I agree with Simonazzi about this point, even if can be criticized under other respect. So my question is whether you agree about this difference between a regional project by Spinelli and a more, let me say, oscillating between the national and the global dimension by Keynes. But what is typical of Keynes is the idea of regions building up a global project. Regarding Archibugi, we have a long discussion since many years. I totally agree with your conclusion, and your topics is crucial. I have a question regarding you are very negative evaluation of the Lisbon strategy. I feel responsible because I'm one of the advisor of the council for the years of the Lisbon strategy. I think I can witness about the impossibility to do more, because we had very little choice when the majority of member states, we were 12 member states at that time, were against the application of the community method, and we proposed the open method of coordination. Well, someone said it was a failure, like you. I respect your opinion, but I invite you to take knowledge of the report of the German presidency of 2007 about the Lisbon strategy, which is extremely positive about the achievements on all respect. Of course, if you have an Italian evaluation, of course Italy was the bad guy, because Italy said something in Brussels and the leaders coming back to Rome, they did the opposite. It was a problem of missing sanctions against the bad guys. Only recommendations are possible. And this is the reason why many of the objectives of the modernization, digital modernization, scientific modernization, were reached in Nordic Europe, including Belgium, Germany, France, but not in Italy. Because of all the parties, not only the right wing, not only Berlusconi. So this is maybe, tell me how to do. I agree that we have to put more money, but if the states don't want to put more money, what do we do? I think the idea is to use the framework program as a multiplicator for national research programs. This is the idea. This is something who has been mentioned also today in the morning about the European semester. European Union is coordinator of national policies, a better coordinator of national by Francesco in the morning. This is a point which has to do also with the presentation of Kregel, because he focused on the asymmetries. I agree that about his analysis. The main asymmetry is between the monetary spectacular unity and economic disunity and diversity. And the question is whether he believes that the European semester, like we said in the morning, can be a way to enhance the level of economic governance comparable with the monetary governance. For instance, in the European semester and other economic governance method. So governance is the key in order to advance toward more unity, monetary unity, social unity, and economic unity. A small detail regarding Simonazzi, I fully agree about your splendid reconstruction. The only point, you are very pessimist about the comprehensive arrangement on investment between European Union and China. In my presentation, I'm very positive about that. And my question is, how do you feel that this is only in favor of Germany? This was your main argument. Because this comprehensive arrangement has been negotiated by the Commission on behalf of the 27, has been voted by the 27, approved by 27 governments, including Italy, with some critics about the fact that Macron was invited and Conte was not invited to the signature ceremony. But the Commission and the Council approved it unanimously. Why this should be only in the interest of Germany? That is a little bit astonishing, but so it's a question for you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mario. Are there any remarks, comments? Daniele,
Did you want us to answer them, or do you want to collect questions?
Oh, well, it depends. If there are questions, we can perhaps collect them.
Domenico, Siniscalco. I have a short one. Slightly presentation, but not the explanation of it. Follow. Do you have any explanation of the protest?
There are. We have problems in understanding what you say because the voice is. Can you perhaps stay closer to the microphone? It might solve.
Maybe it's the line. Anyway, the question is that you haven't hear me.
I don't think we are able to.
No problem. I'll ask you the time.
You can use the chat if you.
Yeah.
If you can, someone. Yeah.
Never mind. I'll do it some other time.
Perhaps it's just a problem of video. If you make your question, if you raise a question without the webcam, perhaps the connection is.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Okay. The question for Sue is about American protest, whether there are explanations already of the shift from the right when the voters supported Trump to the left when I mean the Black Lives Matter as well as other leftist part of the process of protest are emerging.
Okay, thank you. Other questions that we can collect? I also have a question, if I can profit from my role here as chair. And the question is a very general one, but I would very much like you to have your opinion about this. Well, you know, this session focuses in particular on asymmetries, differences, divergences, and perhaps on the negative side of this heterogeneity. So I wonder whether, I mean, your general vision is a pessimistic or an optimistic one. Do you think that perhaps with respect to the first decades of the history of the European Union, when, for instance, we had an ultimate aim of preserving peace, and there was the Cold War, you know, whereas today we perhaps lack an ultimate aim, so that we have many achievements behind us, but then we perhaps lack something to a shining star to follow somehow. This is just a question because, for instance, I remember I think it was Danny Roderick saying that the Baltic states did perform much better at the outburst of the global financial crisis, because they had the ambition to join Europe, and that ultimate objective was enough in order for them in order to perform very well despite the troubles of the general situation. But then, if there are no other questions for the moment being, I would perhaps give the floor to speakers in order of appearance today. So Ian first, and then the list in order: Annamaria, Simonazi, Daniele, Archibugi, and Konzelmann.
Okay, thank you, Mario. The first thing I will say is to try to respond to this, the asymmetry between the monetary and the, I guess, political, we can say it. I did a piece, if I remember right, for the Fondazione Einaudi, for the journal, indicating that Keynes, in his discussions of the clearing union, has this throwaway proposition about regional associations, that it would be much more appropriate to have regional associations, and he makes a number of sort of offhand comments, as he often did. But there was also the idea of political associations that were associated with this, and they're more or less the way I interpreted this was that he was saying, well, fine, yes, if you do have a problem with the political unity and the monetary unity, the one way to solve that problem might be in terms of looking to regional associations. And if memory serves me right, he even refers to things like professional associations and trade unions and things like that, saying this is the place where you get some cohesion in terms of political results, and it would not be inappropriate to introduce some sort of monetary relation in that area. Now, once we've said that, we come to this very difficult proposition, and that is that having gone beyond this single idea of a single currency, we have the idea of the financial system that you're going to set up. And Keynes quite clearly looked upon a clearing union type of system, which was a multi-participatory system, we'll put it that way, in which everybody had a position in terms of determining its impact on the system, rather than the kinds of systems that we've set up after Bretton Woods or that we set up in Europe, in which it is basically the financial sector which has the dominance in terms of that decision making. So implicitly, if we take that one step further, Keynes is saying, well, this is one way to get the financial sector out of the dominance or the competition with the political sector in terms of dealing with those asymmetries. Because in fact, those asymmetries are benefits to the financial sector rather than the other way around. So I think that's the way I would respond to that question. Now, once you've offered me the possibility of saying something, I would just like to pick up a couple of points in terms of this distinction that Sue Konzelmann has raised on this idea of looking, why did what happened in Germany and Italy differ from the US? I've just finished reading a number of things. One of them is Gian Giacomo Bigoni's representation of basically the impact of the US financial sector, and in particular JP Morgan, on the support of Mussolini and the reasons for that support, which was basically the idea that Mussolini provided a stability pole within European reconstruction, that Morgan was very interested in supporting the Wilsonian idea of European unification and European reconstruction. And Mussolini had a very clear objective, and Morgan had a very clear objective, and both of those objectives went together. And Mussolini's success, to a large extent, at least according to Mingoni, came about from the fact that Morgan was continually willing to finance all of the initiatives that Mussolini could never have implemented, and probably would have brought him down much earlier had they not occurred. So I'm back to this idea of the role of the financial sector in terms of the differentiation here. Now, the second one is another strange reading. I've been looking a lot at Upton Sinclair and the epic movement in California, as well as his relationships with Ezra Pound. Now, the reason for this is that both of these are very close to what we now call heterodox monetary theories, in particular, what some of my friends have baptized MMT, which the BBC calls the magical money tree, which is a massive misrepresentation of the approach. In any case, if you look at Sinclair had a movement which was in almost all cases identical to the New Deal. He had popular support in California, won the primary by a massive majority, and it ended up that he was massively defeated in the gubernatorial election. For one reason, because all of the press and the movie magnates decided to run a popular media campaign against him, number one, and secondly, because Roosevelt, in fact, was unwilling to support him in more or less exactly the same principles. So you have here now, I don't know, which it seems to me something of an anomaly within the US position. I mean, clearly he was tagged as being a socialist or a communist or whatever, but Roosevelt managed very nicely to skate through the sort of the Scylla and Charybdis of socialism and communism and convinced people that he was in fact doing something that was very different. And I simply want to raise this as a very strange case in the US case of why we didn't get that result. Because absolutely right, you put up the pictures of Madison Square Garden. The German Bund was very strong, and Philip Roth has already told us exactly what would have happened had Lindbergh won the election, because he wrote a book explaining to us what the results would have been. So you have this sort of strange political dynamic that went on in the US, which was slightly different. Now, getting to my last reference, which is Ezra Pound. Pound always argued, and this I think supports your thesis, that the reason the US didn't have a fascist government is because it already had a government that worked. And the only problem was to convince the government to do the things which were correct. And in fact, more or less, Roosevelt ended up doing them, although Pound did not like Roosevelt at all, nor did he like Sinclair. He thought they were complete idiots because they didn't understand monetary positions. But in fact, he more or less supported this. He said, we needed Mussolini because Italian politicians were too stupid to understand what they were supposed to do and were always fighting amongst each other. So he became, in that sense, and it cost him quite a bit, he became a very strong supporter of Mussolini, while at the same time being an anti-fascist in terms of the United States. So again, you have this sort of strange dichotomy that went on in that period. So that's my push for rehabilitating Ezra Pound.
I'll just say one thing. Those are fantastic comments, Jan. I really appreciate it. Did you know that Mussolini Speaks was a famous Columbia Pictures film in 1933? 1933. It was like the second largest grossing film in the United States at the time. Now you can find the first 10 minutes of it on YouTube, but you can't find anything else. So I just thought I'd see if you'd heard of that.
No, in fact, I'm quite aware of that. The one which is, I think, most interesting to me is this Balbo, who ended up getting himself a statue in Chicago as a result of flying into this famous flying visit that he made to the United States. And it's really quite interesting. The very, very strong political support you had both for, I don't want to say in general fascist or Nazi governments, but for the Italian and the German experiments in terms of expatriate Germans and Italians, who were fantastically strong at that period of time.
Yeah, really interesting.
Okay, thanks. Let's proceed. Annamaria, your turn if you want to. Yeah.
Well, excuse me if I turn the video off because the connection is not very good. I simply answer the question by Mario Telò about the Chinese, European-Chinese treaty. Well, my concern about this treaty is very similar to the one which relates to the entry of China in the World Trade Organization that I spoke about in my paper. The European countries are different. They have different specialization, and even in their trade and investment, foreign investment activities are different. China has been an important market for capital goods and consumer durables goods for Germany. It has been written that the car industry, the German car industry, only exists and survived this crisis because of China. So if we have an investment agreement, let's say in automotive industry, the German industry is made by a global value chain, which is mostly in the eastern countries, Visegrad countries, and in northern Italy and Spain. So the consequences of an investment agreement giving free access to the positive or a negative effect, depending on what the German companies there do. If they use the treatment, the treaty for penetrating the Chinese market, conserving, maintaining the global value chains in the European countries, then it might be a sort of export-led for the whole area. But it may also represent a sort of delocalization while serving the European markets from China, from other cheap sources. So that is what I was mentioning, that multinational corporations need some sort of national support from their states, but there is a contradiction, because if they delocalize, then there is a conflict between domestic production and of the country and the interest of multinational corporations. And I think that in this treaty, German companies are the ones who are profiting more. There might be an interest of French companies in certain sectors such as health, hospitals, and all that. So in the services, I don't see very much, apart from textile, clothing, and some other things, for southern companies, southern industries. And I mean, this can be a very unequal distribution of advantages. Chinese can and are already penetrating in the European markets. With this agreement, it seems that they have tried to, let's say, stabilize their presence, avoiding to get kicked out. So I would say that there are reasons for concern for southern countries.
May I say a word?
Yep.
You have to reactivate your
microphone.
May I take stock of this excellent feedback to give a, let me say, to interplay just 2 minutes?
Yeah, if no one, yeah, if Daniele is.
Thank you very much. Excellent feedback. I'm quite optimistic about the data regarding the competitiveness of Italian companies in China, which will be provide an opportunity to go on by this in this new framework of the CAE. Second argument is very important for the future of global trade. We are, I think, as European, very much interested to stop the bifurcation which is occurring in the world between the American and Chinese markets and companies, and we have to support the global chains. As European, we are the most interested to avoid Cold War and to support global chains, not the Germans, the Europeans. This is an outcome of our international research network. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Daniele?
I got one comment on Mario Tellò, and I think I was too fast. I totally support the Lisbon strategy. And actually, I myself contributed to the Lisbon strategy 20 years ago when we wrote this book, and we participated to the Cascais meeting in the outskirts of Lisbon. I think the Lisbon strategy was a problem on one specific component, namely what should be done for science and technology. Not because the Commission didn't do enough, because the Commission tried to put the resources it had with the framework programs, and to be honest, the framework programs have increased the resources. And this is good. It's good. I mean, if we look at the first framework programs, they were much more limited than Horizon 2020 or even the FP7. So there has been a consistent scaling up of the resources devoted to science and technology, and this has somehow increased the overall budget of the Commission. I'm discussing the European Council, and the European Council, of course, as Mario teaches us, is made by the head of governments of the European member countries. All the head of the governments agreed to increase investment in science and technology, mostly with the national resources. And this was also a pact, because there was the idea that you increase the resources, you increase the public deficit, even in a situation in which the euro started. And then, since knowledge has externalities, all European member countries would have taken some benefits. And therefore, there was an investment, but also a return. And if everybody would do the same, the European knowledge economy would have fostered economic activity, investment, profits, employment, and therefore, there would have been a virtuous cycle. As soon as these head of governments went back home, they've forgotten about that. This was also associated to what later on, after 2008, started to be the austerity policies. And when in doubt on what to cut, many of these governments, especially the governments in the weak parts of the European Union, started to cut the budgets for education, for science and technology, and so on. And that's, I mean, if you like, it's not a Brussels problem. It's a problem within the decentralized nation, up to the point that Ben Doke, Lundvall, and I, at the time, made one of our silly, dreamy proposals in the spirit of Spinelli. We said that together with the ECOFIN, there should have been another body within the European Union for science, technology, and competence building, which would have checked that each member country would have done the job. So not just a European control over the public expenditure, but also European control on the creation of resources. And as you can imagine, the proposal was not taken seriously.
Okay, thank you. Now, Sue, you can reply.
Okay. In response to the other Mario's question, I was really glad that Jan mentioned his paper, because I had come across that paper and thought it was excellent. And so in answering the question about Keynes and his attitudes towards regionalism, I think Jan was much more expert to answer it. I think the point we were trying to make in connecting Spinelli and Rossi, their manifesto, and Keynes, was the fact that Spinelli and Rossi had the objective of a better life for more people, and Keynes had the ultimate objective of a better life for more people. I think Keynes saw economics as the means to that objective, the means to achieving that objective, where Spinelli and Rossi saw a political arrangement such as federalism, or I think they ultimately changed their minds after the end of the Second World War, when Marshall aid was available. So we were looking more at aims and means, and Keynes being more on the economic and Spinelli and Rossi being more on the political side. In response to the question about the left versus right in America, that's a really good question. I'm probably not as well placed to answer it as Jan, as another American on the panel, is, because my family, the impression I get, now I've lived in the UK for 20 years, and the last time I was in America was about, 5 to 10 years ago. And I felt, Jan, you can respond to this, but having lived in the UK for so long, not been back for a while, when I went back, it was for my brother's funeral, and he lived in Arkansas at the time. It just felt to me like the United States was a powder keg, where you had people, people who were much poorer and worse off than I remembered them when I lived in the United States. And everybody was arming themselves because they were afraid. So you've got the rich people who are all living in their gated communities, and the poor people who are barely making it and have nothing more to lose. And everybody was arming themselves. And I just found it a really threatening. In fact, the taxi we took from the airport in Hot Spring, or in Little Rock to Hot Springs, the driver, he was a really friendly driver, but the first thing he did was told us about all the artillery he had under his seat, and how, when he goes home, he has to tell his girlfriend not to shoot him as he's coming in the door. It's like, take me back to the UK, where at least it's illegal to have handguns. And my family, my sense in talking to my family are very strong Republicans and very conservative Catholics, and they don't like Trump particularly, but they voted for Trump, and they're very upset about Biden winning the election, because they're just on that side of the left and right divide in America. And my impression from talking to them is that there's a stronger left and right divide than there was when I lived there, where there wasn't that much difference between the Republicans and the Democrats in terms of policy and things like that. But I don't know, Jan, you might, living in the United States now, which I assume you are, I'm not sure what your sense is. My feeling is actually quite worried for America, because it seems as though there's just such a sharp divide. And I think Biden winning, my family feels completely sure that the election was rigged, and there's conspiracy theories all over the place. And so you've got this group of people that thinks that the election was stolen from Trump, and that Biden is somehow behind it, and the Democrats. And I don't know, that I'll stop there, because I can, bore for Britain. But Jan, I don't know if you've got a different perspective being closer to it than I am.
Yeah,
Okay.
this is really very difficult, because there are so many different things going on at the moment. One of the things which I find very, very interesting, and this is one of the reasons why I was going back and looking at the California elections. Jill Lepore wrote a very nice book on US history, in which she explains, I mean, those of you who are familiar with Democratic Party history, you know that Roosevelt didn't manage to get health care introduced at the same time that Francis Perkins wanted to put it in with Social Security and everything else. So you have this political problem. What Jill did was to pick up this idea and said, look, one of the first things that Harry Truman did was to try and introduce generalized government health care, uniform coverage. And he was basically killed by the AMA, the American Medical Association. So it raises the first question is, why would doctors be in favor of having people die more frequently rather than coming and getting treatment? And basically the answer was that the same people who ran the campaigns against Sinclair also ran the campaign against Truman's healthcare. So already in the 1940s, we have this manipulation of, I don't know how you say, common opinion, popular opinion, in particular areas that deal with left versus right. And basically one of the things which happened, and we know after Barry Goldwater, was that Goldwater lost the election by a very large majority and was not considered as a relevant threat until he managed to get a large number of very influential backers to put together, again, media campaigns in order to change the basic outlook. So now I don't want to go back to be a conspiracy theorist on the wrong side. But if you take the media on the one hand and you take the financial system on the other hand, I think you can pretty much understand why this left-right divide has become more and more extreme, because it is in the interest of both of these in order to do this. And the question is, how do you break that? Okay, now we talk about antitrust and we talk about all sorts of things. This is really not sufficient to do it, because going back to your experience in Arkansas, okay, it used to be the case that these problems were dealt with in Arkansas. Okay, if they were local problems in Little Rock, if it was segregation in Little Rock, it was done on a local basis. Now they're done on a community-wide basis, because everybody has access to everything else. So one of the sort of the shocking things, if you look at the invasion of the Capitol, is the geographical distribution of the people who in fact showed up in order to do this. Okay, you had people who spent days trying to get there, which means that you now have, it's no longer the case that the impact is simply on local issues and the impact of changing impression of the politics of the local areas. It's now the entire country. And this is what is which is really, I think, for me, scary about this whole proposition, because it's no longer the case that you go to California and it's a local Californian issue, or it's New York, it's a local issue. Now all these issues become global, and everybody thinks they have the right to influence what goes on for everybody else in the system. So this is this sort of strange thing is that the people on the right, okay, it's the left which is telling us what to do, but what's happened is that the other side now does exactly the same thing. Is the right now wants to tell everybody else what to do. And how you, as I say, I am not a political scientist, and I look at these things just as as somebody who is a victim rather than being a protagonist. But it is really very, very perplexing to try and figure out how this gets resolved.
Yeah, I think your point about finance and the media is a really interesting one, because in our research on America in particular, finance and the media were very strong in supporting the fascist movement within the United States at the time. Isn't that the case?
Yes, it is. And I think it's also worth thinking about this question of race as well, which played a part certainly in the last election as a result of the Black Lives Matter, but also, of course, in terms of the way that fascism went between the wars. I mean, certainly up until 1933, when Hitler gets a bigger platform for anti-Semitism of a fairly pernicious nature, and indeed starts to cause other supporters, people like Mussolini, I think, was rather less interested in that, but followed Hitler. But certainly one of the bigger problems from the American perspective was Charles Lindbergh, who made a very strongly anti-Semitic speech, and it pretty much killed his reputation overnight. And in that particular case, it effectively undermined the America First Committee that was trying to make sure that America didn't enter, certainly anyway, the European part of the Second World War. And you look at the influence of Black Lives Matter again, it's quite possible that a lot of Trump's electorate was somewhat conflicted by following some of the ideas within Black Lives Matter and some of the issues that maybe drew them towards Trump in terms of employment and things of that nature in some of the less wealthy parts of America, as per the map that we saw earlier on, that pretty much reflected the electoral results in America as well as the investment. So it's an interesting one, but I think with the situation in America, race is a fluid thing, because you get different communities popping in and out. After the First World War, you see a lot of Europeans and Russians appearing, bringing the socialist communist message. Quite a few of them get repatriated fairly swiftly. But of course, eventually you get the Germans and Italians bringing a more fascist message. So it's a lively mix, and I think there seem to me anyway to be more factors in play than a straightforward right-left split, or at least that's the way it looks from an outside point of view.
Yeah, I mean, just not to belabor the point too much, but if you look, let's go back to Black Lives Matter. Okay, once you had the problems in Minnesota, everybody looked at this as you said, finally something positive is going to happen, and we're going to do something about racial discrimination. Okay, I looked at this and I said, I think the right wing did this. Why? Because it took them 30 seconds to turn this into law and order. Trump, the next day, was there with law and order. Defund the police. You then had already all of his military and police support. And suddenly Black Lives Matter was completely reversed in terms of its impact on the election. Okay, this should have been some, from the outside, this should have been something positive. It turned out to be something, it turned out to be something positive for the wrong side. And this was, again, the way the media exploited this. So suddenly, and you can even if you listen, I don't know, I don't sleep at night, I listen to the BBC all the time at night. Okay, I even had somebody with his personal opinion the other day who was talking about these difficulties that we have because during the summer we had urban riots. Now those urban riots were what? They were not urban riots. These were supposedly peaceful protests of people who were involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, saying that it is time we did something about the way the police, in fact, enforce certain regulations according to race. Okay, so even this idea, the BBC was willing. I know, I'm fine. This is, again, you have the whatever side, and you have to have two sides and everything else. But I was just appalled by the fact that they had someone there who was saying, well, really, we shouldn't push too much against what they did in the Capitol, because what about the urban riots? And I'm going, okay, this is media, and media is to a large extent responsible for this. Once we got Trump off of Twitter, he disappeared. I mean, this was the calmest week that we have had in the entire country, because all of a sudden, Nemesis was no longer there. You didn't have to log in every morning to find out what the hell happened today, which is going to screw up my life. Okay, so the only optimistic part I have is that, in fact, if we do manage to get some control over the media and to muzzle this, there's a possibility that, you know, there is a, what should we say, a calming of the rhetoric, which is going on both sides. And that's, as I say, as optimistic as I can be about it.
We have run out of time now because it's 5:30. Thanks so much for this lively discussion. I give the floor to Roberto for the conclusions of this conference. Thanks again.
Thanks, Mario. Our time at disposal is almost finished, but before concluding, I would like to give the floor to Domenico Siniscalco, who is president of Fondazione Einaudi, for some final remarks.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Let me turn off my video. If you don't hear me, just wave your hands and I'll give you back the floor. I believe it was a great conference. I want to thank the organizers, the contributors. I don't thank the Fondazione because I'm part of it, but basically it was an excellent conference. We had 20 speakers, 5 sessions, 4 topics, but more importantly, it was not a conference in history of political or economic thought, but it was rather a discussion of the foundations of Europe at the moment. Today, I enjoyed very much the paper on contradictions of Europe by Jan. I enjoyed very much Anna Simonazzi paper on the tensions within Europe and trade and specialization. I enjoyed, as usual, Daniele presentation and the piece on populism by Sue and on politics by Sue. I don't summarize, of course, but I'll tell you what is my main takeaway, as well as one question. My main takeaway is that Europe is fundamentally a permanent workshop with many moving parts that need to be addressed and managed continuously. When I was younger, when the euro was created, when you're younger, you are more myopic. You have less of a long-run view. Now it seems to me that there are so many interesting fundamental topics to be addressed. The next one will be how to manage these huge debts. What will be the impact of the coronavirus on the economic and political situation? So I believe lots of work to do and lots of food for thought from this conference. The question is, how do we disseminate these results? Because many of the papers I listened to, and I apologize for not being present to the whole conference, were very, very interesting, have an important and relevant impact on the current debates, and it's certainly worth putting a substantial effort in dissemination. Thank you very much. Roberto?
Okay, thanks, Domenico. Well, in conclusion, let me make some very short comments on the meeting. Well, the Manifesto of VENTOTENE, as you know, inspired the foundation of the European Union in the post-war years. But is a European economy in the spirit of VENTOTENE Manifesto still possible? This is the question, the issue posed in this conference organized in occasion of the 80th anniversary of the VENTOTENE Manifesto. Well, the construction of Europe has reached, I said in my introduction 2 days ago, a turning point. To reverse the negative trends, Europe must address many crucial issues, not least those of its economic organization and the rules of governance. In this reconstruction, is a European economy in the spirit of the VENTOTENE Manifesto still possible? The conference discussed this issue in 5 sessions, and 18 papers presentation. And the answer for the majority of participants is yes. The Manifesto of Ventotene is a classic text, a model whose spirit is alive now than ever before, as Mario Telò and also Sue Konzelmann, more than anyone else, stressed in their speeches. Well, in the context of European reconstruction, the Manifesto of Ventotene remains a document of great relevance, perhaps even more important today than when it was first written. I do not use the word reconstruction by chance. It was used 1 century ago in the 1920s by Keynes, who edited the famous reconstruction supplements of the Manchester Guardian. In this perspective of reconstruction, the Manifesto can still inspire change, of course, with important qualification. In fact, all the presentation have dealt with the topic, focusing on challenges and issues and offering materials for rewriting the rules, introducing recent and less recent but not old-fashioned debates and contribution and criticism. But what is important to emphasize in this perspective of reconstruction, the founding principle of Europe, the founding tenets of Europe contained in the Manifesto of Ventotene do matter. In conclusion, thanks very much the speakers for their speeches, to the chairs for the different sessions, and all of you for attending this conference and developing such an interesting and we hope a fertile discussion. I inform you that the videos of the conference will become available on the YouTube channel of the Fondazione Einaudi. And as you know, I confirm that the papers will be published in a special issue of the Annals of the Fondazione Einaudi, the number 2 of the 2021. And you will receive in a few days a letter about the technicalities of the publication. So thanks again, hoping that we'll be able to meet again in person in a new conference organized by the Fondazione Einaudi. Goodbye to everyone, and thank you.